With that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Kelsey Ruger. He's a colleague and a good friend, and he is, like me, an old-time veteran of the technology and design space. He's currently Vice President of User Experience and Digital Marketing at Trust. Kelsey's also been involved in projects for many Fortune 100 companies touching, easily 5 million users. I met Kelsey a few years back. Can't remember how many years ago now, but it was when he was the president of the Houston Interactive Marketing Association. And when I met him then, I saw what a leader he was then, and I've seen it throughout his career at all the companies he's been at. So why don't we welcome Kelsey to the stage. Thank you very much.
Can everyone hear me? It's like the booming voice in the room now. So I like to start by talking about what it's like when I introduce what I do to my family and friends. And so when I tell them, hey, I help people build better software and I help make it more usable, usually the look that I get from family members is something like this, right? Like, what does that mean? And so then I'll come back and say, well, I use technology design and an understanding of human behavior to help build products people love. And it dawned on me a few months ago that one of the reasons that people struggle with understanding what we do in user experience is because we don't always translate it in a way that's understandable for everyone. And the thing that I realized also is people don't love software. People tolerate software. They love products, like they love consume. If you say to a person, hey, I helped build an iPhone app, usually what they ask is, well, did you do Angry Birds? Or did you make the iPhone? And so they don't really understand it. And so what I wanted to talk to you guys about today is how you build products people love. And a lot of what you guys will hear when you're in user experience is, here's how you use this tool, or here's this technique. But one of the great things about human experience is that in the UX world, we can create products that people love too. You just have to understand how to approach that. And so this morning, what I want you guys to do first is think back to the very first product that you really loved. Like, really think about the first thing you really loved. And I'm going to tell you guys about the product that I first loved. And I don't know if everybody in here has ever heard of Lincoln Logs. Does everybody know Lincoln Logs? So this was the first product that I really loved as a kid, even before I liked Legos. In hindsight, you can only do so much with Lincoln Logs. You can build houses. But as a kid, I thought this was awesome. And it helped me get into tinkering and learning how to build things. And it helped me really understand what it meant to connect when you're creating solutions. And so what I want you guys to think about next is, what was your experience like? Or what words would you use to describe your experience with your first product that you love? Anybody have a word that they could use to describe it? You guys are going to get asked a lot of questions today. All right. Joy, fun. What else? Addicting. Customizable. Anything else? Challenging. And so one of the things that when I ask people this question that is a common thread among all of them is we use emotional or feeling words. These are the words that personalize things for us. And what that tells us is that humans are relationship driven. The problem that we run into is in business, we use emotionless words. And a lot of the things that we do in business are more transaction driven. And you guys probably see this all the time, right? Businesses don't really connect in a way that is personalized to you. And the example I used with one of my mentees the other day was, whenever you call in and you have a problem and you're calling customer service, does it bug anyone else when you're really upset about something and they say, oh, sir, I'm really sorry that happened to you. That would really frustrate me too. And it doesn't come across as genuine. It comes across as something that they're reading from a script. And that happens because what they try to do is they try to fake the the emotion instead of giving a real connection. And so what you find out is that the people are the business. And I always tell everyone this: companies and products are not the brand, they're not the thing that they do, it's the people. If you take the people out of a company, you have no company or product. And so what I want you guys to kind of pick up from this presentation today is, what are the 3 things that you should shift and the way you think about them? And some of these things may seem counterintuitive when we talk about them, but when you put it all together, it makes a whole lot of sense. And so there's 3 things. The first is going to be, you stop thinking in parts. And we'll talk about why thinking of UX separately from technology and separate from sales and separate from all the things that people see in product delivery doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you want to create something that people love. And stop thinking about MVPs. I'm guilty of this too. Like when you work in software, a lot of times you'll hear this term called MVP, or minimal viable product. And I'm going to tell you why I've stopped talking about minimal viable. The concept is still there, but I think of it a little bit differently now. And then I'm going to talk about the 3 things about love that you should think about when you're thinking about your products. And so the first thing we want to talk about is people don't experience products in parts. And we're going to start off with a restaurant, right? Like, let's talk about a visit you make to a restaurant and you're having a great time. Maybe the atmosphere is great. You order your food and it comes out wrong. And I waited tables when I was at college. I waited tables at Papacitos, which I know a lot of people in Houston work at one of the Papas at one point or another in their lifetime. But I always hated when something would go wrong with the customer's order and the manager would come over and say, "I'm sorry, the kitchen messed up your order." And a lot of people will ask me, well, why did you not like that? And my response is, because the customer doesn't care. What they care about is that their food was messed up. They don't care whether it was my fault, the kitchen's fault, the hostess, or whatever. And whenever you start to pinpoint which part of the process broke down, what it looks like to a customer is that you're not taking responsibility for the product as a whole. And so when we're thinking about user experience and what you guys should really be thinking about when you're constructing products, and we do this a lot in almost every company that I work with, is we start at the very beginning. We don't start with, what happens when this person opens the app. We start with, how did this person find out about the product? How did they get the product? How did you actually deliver the product to them? And once they had the product, how do you get them to come back and rebuy? So all of these things are important. The problem is, in user experience, we focus on the first 2 things a lot and not necessarily all of these pieces. And so when you're building a product that you want people to really care about, think a lot about, and Apple does still do this really well. When you walk into the Apple store, when you get the packaged product, when you open the box, the software, all of that is intended to be a part of your product experience. It's not just the software on the phone. And so when we're thinking about this, as a UX professional, you have to understand more than just the UX. You have to understand the whole business process. And I tend to think of UX sort of at the center of all of these things. So there's technology that is used to deliver the function. There's the design, which typically gets associated with UX. And here's one career point I'll always tell everyone. If you really want to move up in your career in UX and you think you want to be considered as more than just a designer, you got to move out of that design bucket. And you got to understand these other pieces that drive not just an interface, but drive the business as a whole. And so making that shift from the point where we think about the things on the left, which are the way we typically describe them, and then what they actually mean, what I'm going to tell you is there's a slightly different view of the MVP that we'll cover in a second. But how does this all tie back to love? And I'm going to give you guys what I call the Star Trek rules, or the Star Trek rules. And to help you guys remember this, I associated it with famous characters from the TV show. And so the Kirk rule is, beautiful looks good, but it might lack substance, right? And so It's great to look good. It's great to have beauty in your interfaces, but if it's not functional or it doesn't meet a need, it's probably not going to it's not going to be loved long term. And then there's the McCoy rule where functional works, but it isn't very engaging, and definitely don't ask it to be anything other than a doctor. And then, of course, there's the Spock rule. It's usable, but it might lack emotion. And so none of these people would be great people to be in a relationship with long term because they only have part of the formula. And so what that has to do with love is you guys have to think beyond an MVP. And so some people might think of an MVP as it has all the functions. And I have this debate pretty much at every company I've ever worked at. MVP is almost always from our perspective. It's never from the customer's perspective 100% because they have to use it on a regular basis. We're not using it because we're not the users. And so what you really want to aim for is what I call a minimal lovable product. And a minimal lovable product isn't just the baseline functions, it's also the things that you need to make sure that person wants to use your product on a repeated basis. And so the products that people really love, they're not created from reason, they're not created from logic, they're actually created because people connect with them and they have a reason to want to keep coming back and using your product over and over again. So the first thing that you guys should start to shift, and this was really hard for me, is to think of the product, because everything we do is focused around users, right? It's user experience, it's user testing. But if you start to think about those users as real people when you're using them, and a lot of times we'll use things like personas to be a stand-in for a user, but one of the things that you guys will hear from a lot of people who've done UX for a long time is you got to spend time in the field. Like you got to actually get out and use the product. And probably the best example I can give you, this is the company I was at before. We did mobile software that was intended to help you buy fuel at the pump. And so one of the things that we always had to do is we had to go out and see what people were doing at a gas pump. And I'll give you a perfect example of how this plays out. When you guys go to the gas pump and you've made that purchase, what do you do next? Like, give me some examples of what you do next. Anyone? Say it again? Well, you're pumping the gas right now. What do you do after you started the nozzle? Anybody? Go back inside. What else? You use your phone, but what are you doing on your phone? Checking emails, playing a game. And so one of the features that we had in our app was this ability to pop up ads. And everyone kept saying, well, we need to pop up ad while they're pumping gas. And I kept saying, people don't do that. They do not sit there and look at an app that is an ad while they're pumping gas. They're either throwing the phone back in the car and going inside, they're checking email. And so understanding what people really do versus a persona that might fit what we want them to do is really important. And you have to really think about this from a people perspective to get that point. And so one of the things that I came to the conclusion of was MVP usually meant our choices. And it meant here's the things that we think will make up a minimal viable product, when even a couple more features or maybe taking things out would make it more acceptable to the people who actually have to use it. And so the thing that I want you to take away from this is the person who is using your product gets to decide how they fall in love with you. It's kind of like you can't make someone fall in love with you, right? Like you can only create the environment that might make someone fall in love with you, but you can't make them do it. And so the first shift that you guys should start, or the second shift you guys should be making is not thinking just about user experience, but think about the user's experience. And it's a subtle change, but it's a big one. And I always tell people, even though we call ourselves user experience designers, you can't actually design a person's experience because we all have different ones. So if I went and I used an interface and someone else went and used an interface, it's going to be wholly unique to both of us because we bring different experiences to the plate to begin with. And so what you have to do is make sure that you're crafting the right touch points to make sure that, one, they accomplish the goal that you expect them to accomplish, and that it's something that they're happy with. And so in order to do that, you have to make this third shift, and it's really understanding as true love, or finding true love, is one of the hardest things to do, but it's actually pretty easy if you simplify some of the things that you have to do with that. And so how many of you guys remember this television show? I've heard of this television show. Some of you have heard of it. And so this was, the guy in the middle is called Mystery. And his thing was that he would go around and he would teach guys how to pick up women in social environments. But how do you guys think he did it? What was he doing? He was doing things like negging. He was doing what he's doing in this picture. It's called peacocking, where you wear something really outrageous and it's purposely done to get attention. If you had to boil that down to one word, what is he doing? Well, okay, yeah. He's lying. It's manipulation, right? And so manipulation is not a great pathway to love. And this is one of the reasons why so many people have such a visceral response, a negative response to marketing now, right? Like they feel like marketing is a manipulation. And I've dealt with this in many ways in many different companies. And so one of the ones that you guys all see all the time is company wants you to come work for them, right? And so they say, we have this great culture. We do Margarita Fridays, or we do work from home policy. And then when you get there, you realize that that was all smoke and mirrors. It was just to get you in the door. And nobody really does all that stuff, even though they say it. And so one of the things that I always say is just be yourself. And I'm going to talk about why just being yourself is important from a product perspective, especially in a world today where there's millions and millions of product SKUs and millions of different options that people have. That's okay. You don't have to please everyone. But the key here is don't try to manipulate people with your product. And one of the crazy things is today in UX, a lot of us are taught a lot about psychology, and you learn a lot of tricks that you could use to get people to do certain things. And they work because humans are pretty predictable when it comes to certain behavior. But the problem is that's not going to lead to a long-term sort of loving relationship with the customers that you have. And so in science, there's 3 stages that they've identified scientifically for love. And I'm going to tell you these stages. One of them you're going to be like, whoa, I don't see how that applies to my product. And it is the first one, right? Lust is the first stage, but I always think of lust not from a sexual standpoint, but think of love from a hormonal standpoint. There's a hormone, in women it's estrogen, and in men it's testosterone. And in those hormones are intended to get people to want to procreate. But those hormones also show up when we are dealing with products, right? And then you do you do attraction, which is the next stage, which is what builds that emotional connection with that person. And then attachment is the long-lasting feeling that you have. And so what I thought about was, how does this relate to what we do in products? And so let's think about, how do you make someone long for your product? And you guys see this all the time in commercials, especially when it comes to consumer products. They do it, especially if it's food, right? Like, how many of you guys have ever seen a food commercial? Like, you see a Wendy's burger, you're like, man, that looks delicious. And then when you show up at Wendy's, you say, that is not the burger from the commercial. That's what they're doing, right? And so when you find out what companies do to make that food look appetizing, it goes back to what I was saying before about manipulation. In fact, they do things like putting wax on meat, and they spray the burgers with like baby oil to make the burger glisten and shine, or they'll pump the meat up with gel to make it look good for the commercial. but you never get anything that looks nearly that appetizing when you show up. But it's intended to build this longing. The thing that you should focus on when it comes to longing is how do you create the best first impression? And one of the best ways to create first a good impression is by thinking about not just your login process and your sign-up process, but extending that back to how they got to the application in the first place. And so I'm going to pull another example from a product that I worked on. So think about a product that, like the one I mentioned before, where the primary use happens outside of an office space or outside of a residential place. You have to use it like at a gas station, or you're using it at Target. And I'm going to use the Target app. So when I went into Target, I guess it was about 6 weeks ago, everyone in the store was bugging me about using the Target app and that I could get discounts, but they were doing it while I was at the cash register. I'm getting ready to check out, and they don't know where I'm going. They don't know whether I'm in a hurry. They don't know whether I have something else I need to do, but they've been told, get people to download this app. What would have been more effective is if there were signs in the store that told me about it, or if they had identified certain products that they were going to put on special to help onboard me to the app. And so when you think about onboarding, it's not just the sign-up process, it's how that person found out about it and whether or not you're targeting them at the right time. Because if you target them at the wrong time, you're not going to be able to create this first step. And the second step is showing value. And this is probably, to me, the most critical step. You build appeal because people find value in what you're offering. So even if it's beautiful, if it doesn't solve a problem for them, they're probably not going to use it long term, especially when it comes to mobile software. And what I will always tell people is, if you have an app and you get people to download it, you're not competing against your traditional competitors. So if you are a game, you're not just competing against other games, you're competing against Facebook, you're competing against messaging and email and all the other things that distract them on that device. So your goal is to show value at the right time, and it doesn't come from constantly popping up push notifications or sending them SMS messages, because that could have the opposite effect. When you design those types of things, you have to figure out what are the types of things that you need to be delivering to that customer's experience to make them feel valued. And so the last piece is what I call shifting from dating to being married, right? Like, you want to shift from they think they like your app and they're getting to use it to they find this as, they find your app to be a utility, or your software to be a utility. And the way you do this is by focusing on painkillers versus vitamins. And so this analogy I use is, how many of you guys, if you had $5 and you could decide on a bottle of painkillers or a bottle of chewable vitamins, you would pick the vitamins? Only a few people. And so this is the point, right? Like, sometimes, so vitamins, everybody wants them, right? But if worst case comes to worst case, they're going to pick the painkiller because they know what it does. And it's the same thing with software. And I always point to the example of Facebook, because everyone thinks that social media falls in the vitamin category, but social media actually falls in the painkiller category, because what it's doing is it's helping people fill a social gap and helping them feel that need for connection to other people. So it's actually killing a different pain. And so if you think about how you build loyalty, you got to figure out how you kill people's pains, not vitamins, because vitamins are great, but they're hard to build a long-lasting relationship with if they don't eventually convert into something that people want to have that relationship. And so let's kind of talk about new users as dating. And so think about the first two items. You're trying to get them to first adopt your program or first adopt your software. Then you want to quickly shift them into not just loving your product, but getting to the point where they become advocates. How many of you guys have ever recommended a bit of software or something that you bought to another person? Why do you do that? You know they're going to use it. It's useful. What else? You trust it. Right. And so it's trustworthy, and we're going to talk about that a little bit in a second. But the whole idea is you know that it's going to deliver something of value. And so the thing I want to explain about this before we get into the principles that I'm going to talk about is one strategy won't work for every type of user. And I tell this to nearly every kind of customer I have is you might have a project or a process that works to acquire users, and your interface or your product works in that case. As you move through the life cycle from building habits to the person using it on a regular basis to the point where they're an advocate, everything about what you should have in the software is different. And it's different at each stage. And so you kind of have to take that into account. So in order to do this, I've identified some principles that I think make up a great framework. And I've taken some images from pop culture. And so here's one thing I want everybody, you don't all have to do it, but if you want to win a prize, take out a piece of paper, and for each one of the slides that's coming up, you can't Google this, you might be able to Google it, but if you could tell me all of the references on the slide, I'll pick from all of the people who get the right answer. And so, and there's a bonus, maybe a tiebreaker, if we get to that point. And so, the first principle is find your soulmate. And all of us have heard, you have to find the user groups that really want to use your software. I think you should take it a step further. Your soulmate isn't just a niche of people that want your software, that could potentially want your software. And I'm going to use this room as an example, right? Like everyone in this room is potentially interested in careers in UX. However, a soulmate is someone inside that niche group that actually really is ready to buy what you're selling, or they're really wanting what you're doing. And so a lot of times what we end up doing is we use demographics to narrow down. I actually think you need to go further, especially in today's marketplace where there's so many different options. And there's a term that a lot of people use, and it's called 1,000 true fans. And 1,000 true fans will buy from you every time, whereas just a niche group or a demographic group, they might because they fit it. But your soulmate is someone that is matched to you nearly perfectly. And this is one of the counterintuitive things, because most people would say, well, what do you mean? You have this audience, but really what you're aiming for is the people who really, really, really want what you are selling or what you have to offer, because it's going to be easier to sell to them. The second stage, and you guys all, does everyone who's going to do this have this first one? Oh man, this is an easy one too. This one's easier. You guys should all get this reference. And so, let's say your soulmate is Paula Abdul. You want to design specifically for Paula. And the way you do this, I'm going to break out how this usually works out in most companies, is how many of you guys have ever heard of NPS, Net Promoter Score? So in NPS, they tell you, find your promoters, find your neutrals, and find your detractors. If you're designing for your soulmate, who should you design for in that group? Only the promoters. And most people will say, well, why don't you go back and find out what the detractors want? And the reason I say that is because usually if you design for your promoters, you will eventually solve the problems for the detractors too. But if you don't design for your promoters, the people who already want what you have, it makes it a more difficult process to get to a product that people love. And you guys have probably heard companies, Basecamp did this, right? So Basecamp said from the very beginning, we're going to design this way, we're only going to target these people, and that's who we build for. And most of the time when you see products that get rabid fan bases, that's how they got there, is they focused on the people who really wanted it, and they hit those other numbers as time goes. And that's called the law, the curve of innovation, right? And so you guys have all seen the bell curve where you have your early adopters, your late adopters, your early majority, and then people who still use rotary phones. So you got to focus on that first group that really loves your product, and they'll help you build toward the end of that. The third principle, and I really struggled with whether or not I wanted to use this particular slide. Here's what I want to tell you about this slide, is a lot of times people say, well, are you saying that you have to be attractive to win people over? And the reason I picked this one is because, I don't know if you guys have, I almost gave away the answer. If you guys have seen this movie, you know there was nothing wrong with the character in the first slide, right? Like, she was smart, she had a college degree. What she didn't really grasp is that the career that she was going into required a different approach to what she was doing. But what she found out along the way is it wasn't just about outside appearance, it was the total package. And that's really what you have to think about from a UX perspective. I used to have this friend of mine, and he would come up to me and he would say, well, I can't get anyone to go out on a date with me. And I would look at him and I would say, well, you dress like a bum. I said, you can't expect someone to be attracted to you if you don't even care about how you appear to that person. Like, it's a two-way street. And it's sort of the same thing with your product, right? Like, you can't expect people to love your product if you haven't gone through all of the steps to make people understand your product and love it. And the fourth one we've talked about a little bit earlier, but it's having something of value. And I like this one. This is actually a remake of a movie from the 80s. But in this movie, one of the characters got into trouble, and the other character bailed her out in exchange for her posing as his girlfriend. And so what the characters found out was the thing that they thought was of value wasn't really what the other person valued. And so in one case, the social status, and in the other case, not getting in trouble, they found different values. And I think when you find your soulmate, you have to be aligned with finding that thing that they value in your software. So if you're building a software that's a to-do list, figure out whether your soulmate is an entrepreneur or that person is a designer, because they will have different things that they value in a to-do list software. And that kind of goes back to picking who your soulmate is, right? And so you need to make sure you understand them well enough so that when you're building this thing of value, it's the right thing. And if you guys don't get this one right, this one, there's even a Broadway show for it. It doesn't really matter if you look great if you create negative emotions, right? So you could have great software, it's well designed, and then your customer service is bad. Or you have great software and the onboarding process breaks. Or the interface is great and the software crashes all the time. People remember all of that stuff because it's all tied to their particular experience with the software. And so as you're working through your software, make sure that at every touch point that it's a positive emotion, whether it's a micro interaction in the interface or it is making sure they can get support at the right time to help round out what you are building in a product. The sixth item is create meaningful connections. And so I actually liked using this slide because meaningful connections doesn't have to always be about romantic connections in real life, right? Like, it could be your best friend. It has to be something that is meaningful to the person who is receiving that experience and something that they can connect to on more than one occasion. And so one of the pieces of software that I actually use a lot, that I never thought that I would use a lot, is my banking software. It's because most banking institutions have figured out the easier we make it for people to bank with us, the more money we make. And so when you're thinking about making that connection, sometimes you have to do some counterintuitive things that you might not think fit with the brand that you've built, but those things actually make the experience better for that end user. And the last one is be trustworthy. And that be trustworthy is a dead giveaway for what this movie is if you've not seen it. But you got to do things that make people trust your software. And this is one of the things that someone mentioned earlier. If what you sold in your marketing doesn't match what you actually released, and this is true probably more so in B2B software than it is in consumer software, because consumer software, you can't get away with it as much. In business-to-business software, we use the change order to deflect this, right? So you sell the software, and then when someone says it didn't do what I wanted, there's a change order. That's where you lose trust with people. Without calling out the company, there's a CRM software that I've used at like 4 different companies, and every single time we've implemented it, I tell people they're going to sell you something, and then they're going to come back and ask for $100,000. And every single time it happens because the company oversells what they can actually deliver, and that erodes trust. And so the first thing that you should understand about any product is you gotta have what you're selling and marketing as the first thing in building. Imagine if, actually, I don't even have to ask you guys to imagine this. How many of you guys have ever used a dating app here? Come on, right? Everyone's used them. How many of you have ever shown up to a date and the person was not who they appeared to be when they put themselves on the app? That's right. And so that's kind of what we're getting to, right? Like, you don't want to oversell what it is that you're going to deliver. And this whole trustworthiness thing, you'd be amazed at how much you can get back from customers when they trust you. You can make more mistakes. You can recover from those easier because they understand that you have their best interest at heart. But when you make mistakes with people and they don't trust you, it's the 3rd degree, and they don't want to work with you long term. And so thinking through the sort of things that we talked about today, there's 3 things that you need to shift. Understanding that people don't buy in parts. They buy whole product experiences, not just the UI or the design. Make sure your product is lovable on a minimum level, like they actually like using your software and they like working with you as a company. And then you use the love stages instead of manipulation. So understanding what happens at each stage of a romantic or relationship development. And then your 7 principles. On this last slide, I call them the Lux principles, but I figured that would be easier for you guys to remember than pleasure principles. So find your soulmate, design specifically for that soulmate. Make sure what you're designing is desirable, not just from an interface perspective, but from a whole product experience perspective, and that it's of something of value. Make sure that the emotions that are attached to what you're designing are positive, and that it's a meaningful connection. And last, make sure you are trustworthy, and that they trust using your product and working with you as a company as a whole. Awesome. So, who thinks they got all 7 of the answers right? Oh man, nobody? 1 person? 1 person? 2 people? Does anybody want to come up and read their answers? Okay, let's hear your answers in the back. What was the first one? No. Well, you got to get all 7. You know, that's right. And actually, 1 person, the last time I did this same thing, the person got it wrong because they said, "Can't Buy Me Love" instead of "Love Don't Cost a Thing." And so "Can't Buy Me Love" is the movie from the 80s. "Love Don't Cost a Thing" and so your prize is the Lincoln Logs. So you have to come up and get it. The Adjustment Bureau. So the Adjustment Bureau, I don't want to ruin it for everyone, but it's a movie about a guy and a girl who meet each other and they fall in love, and there's this group of angel-like people who are conspiring to keep them apart because fate has determined that they're not supposed to be together, but they keep finding their way back to each other. I don't want to ruin the whole movie, but that's essentially the plot. All right. And I have no time for questions. 3 minutes for questions. Any questions? Awesome. Well, thank you all.